Good evening again, ladies and gentlemen. And I guess in order to do justice to Keith's presentation, I'll do more reading than I usually would, so you'll have to bear with me and forgive me for that. Perhaps the most notable deficiency in the artillery of the Australian divisions during the early operations on the rugged Gallipoli Peninsula in 1915 was the lack of howitzers to bring fire into the gullies, entrenchments and gun positions sheltering the Turkish forces. The provision of these assets was beyond Australia's capacity at the outbreak of the Great War, and how this was addressed and how the howitzer batteries were incorporated into the organisation of the Australian Divisional Artillery by the time they began arriving in France in early to mid-1916 is the subject of this paper. In the British Army, the field artillery howitzer had dropped out of favour with the introduction of rifled guns by the 1860s. By the turn of the century, with the introduction of a breech-loading howitzer, which had been introduced during the Second Boer War, had demonstrated the value of an indirect fire weapon that could place a high explosive shell on a target in natural or entrenched cover that could not be reached by flat trajectory guns and infantry small arms. So on the outbreak of the Great War, a regular British infantry division included a howitzer brigade of 3 batteries, totalling 18 quick-fire 4.5-inch howitzers. Its territorial force counterpart, however, had only 1 howitzer battery of 2 batteries, howitzer brigade of 2 batteries, totalling 8 breech-loading 5-inch howitzers. So the practice of brigade commanders training the batteries that they would command in war and the establishment of the Divisional Artillery Commander and his staff had only been belatedly and indeed begrudgingly introduced. Whereupon in Australia, the only active howitzer battery was just 6 years old in 1914 and was equipped with only 4 5-inch howitzers of a 2 decades old design. Training of field artillery as a brigade in Australia was virtually unknown at that stage. An organisation of artillery at divisional level did not exist. So while the principles for the employment of howitzers may have been known to Australian gunners prior to the war, their practice was negligible, and the command structure for tactical employment of howitzers as a component of an artillery force was non-existent. The lack of modern equipment meant that the 1st Australian Division embarked for the Middle East in late 1914 with neither a howitzer battery, a howitzer brigade, nor a heavy battery. These resources in both men and materiel did not exist in any sufficiency amongst the British forces in Egypt either. And the best that could be done for the initial Gallipoli operations was the allocation of 2 batteries of the Indian Mountain Artillery, equipped with 10-pounder guns to the 1st Australian Division. And those of you who attended the first seminar would remember Brigadier Muhammad Asgar's presentation on the provision of the Indian Artillery Brigades at that stage. But it was not until 2 months later, after the landing, that a battery of 5-inch howitzers and 2 4.5-inch batteries were then allotted to the division from the RA. The demand for howitzers at the time led to the dispatch from Australia of its only 4 howitzers in August 1915, and they arrived off Gallipoli in November but weren't disembarked. The 2nd battery of the 1st Artillery Brigade was made up to the establishment of a howitzer battery, less drivers and artificers, on the 2nd of December 1915 and moved to Imbros for training. But the evacuation of Gallipoli in December 1915 meant that the battery never functioned nor supported the landings. The allocation of 2nd Battery and its howitzer role almost certainly occurred because a substantial nucleus of that battery had been recruited from the 44th Battery of the Citizen Military Forces, to which unit these howitzers actually had been drawn. So on to Egypt then. And by the end of January 1916, the AIF had concentrated in Egypt, and thought had been given to the expansion of the force and its employment in Europe. 2 additional divisions of infantry were to be raised from the existing formations and reinforcements in Egypt already, and a further infantry division was to be raised in Australia. The War Office directed on the 31st of January that the organisation to be adopted was to be in accordance with War Establishments Part 7. And we heard from Garth before that these changes in the British Expeditionary Forces artillery structures were things that the AIF started to emulate. And it was on this basis that divisional artillery was to consist of 3 field artillery brigades, each of 4 gun batteries, and 1 howitzer brigade of 4 howitzer batteries. And this would entail the raising in Egypt of 16 howitzer batteries, in addition to 30 new field batteries, from an existing trained force of only 18 field batteries. Quite an expansion. The authority for raising these first AIF howitzer batteries is dated on the 2nd of March 1916, with the exception being that there were only to be 3 howitzer batteries per brigade and not 4, just because of the lack of numbers. And these batteries were uniquely numbered outside of the field battery sequence, commencing at 101. And the outcome of this reorganisation and the new establishment of the divisional artillery are shown as Table 1 and Figure 1 here. So fortuitously, the 3 batteries required for the 1st Australian Division were already in existence, and on 18th of February 1916, the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Field Artillery Brigades of this division had provided the Carters for the 12th Field Artillery Brigade. And this brigade had been raised for the 4th Australian Division, but on March 1916 this was redesignated the 21st Howitzer Brigade, combining 101, 102 and 103 batteries. The 2nd Division going across the line. The 2nd Division raised the 22nd Howitzer Brigade on the 8th of March 1916 from personnel from its existing artillery units. The 4th and 5th Divisions, further across the line there, were less fortunate, with the 24th and 25th Howitzer Brigades being raised in March 1916 purely from a small cadre of trained personnel drawn from 1st and 2nd Divisions and brought up to strength primarily using infantry battalion roundouts. Meanwhile, the 23rd Howitzer Brigade, in support of the 3rd Division, was being raised from reinforcements and recruits at the artillery training camp in Maribyrnong in Victoria in March 1916, and this brigade embarked for England on the 20th of May 1916. The first 2 Howitzer Brigades proceeded to France at the end of March 1916 and were fully equipped from the depots at Le Havre, prior to their batteries being deployed into the line in mid-April 1916. And each battery was allocated for tactical purposes to a field artillery brigade, forming a group responsible for the covering of fire of an allotted front of the division. The headquarters of the Howitzer Brigades did not have operational control of their batteries or their ammunition column during the operations at this time. And so in effect, they became tactically redundant while their subunits were in the line. This situation may be behind the order eventually given by General Headquarters in France on 6th of May 1916, directing that all field brigades of divisional artillery were to become mixed, that is, consisting of 3 gun batteries and 1 howitzer battery. And the howitzer brigades were then to be reorganised as the 4th Field Artillery Brigade. This reorg provided a logical solution to the issues of command and administration, at the same time as providing a single brigade unit with multiple complementary capabilities, i.e. low angle and high angle. The method by which this reorganisation was accomplished differed between the 5 Australian divisions, and the final organisation is shown here in Table 2 and Figure 2. So how did that play out? In the 1st Division, the 3 howitzer batteries were transferred to the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Field Artillery Brigades respectively, with 1 18-pounder battery transferred from each of these brigades to the 21st Field Artillery Brigade. From the 2nd Division, a similar process was followed, where the 22nd Howitzer Brigade transferred its batteries to the 4th, 5th and 6th Field Artillery Brigades respectively, receiving 1 18-pounder from each in turn. And this was done in May 1916. In contrast, for the 3rd Division, the the batteries from the 23rd Howitzer Brigade were converted to field batteries. So effectively they didn't move, they just changed their equipment. And the 4th battery of each field artillery brigade was converted to a howitzer battery. For the 4th and 5th divisions, though, the reorg for the artillery didn't occur until they actually concentrated in June in France, in July 1916. And in the 4th Division, the 24th Howitzer Brigade converted 2 of its batteries to field artillery to field batteries and received a 3rd from the 12th Field Artillery Brigade. The 12th and 11th Field Artillery Brigades converted 1 each of their batteries into a howitzer battery. And in the 5th Division, the 25th Howitzer Brigade transferred 1 battery each of its 13th and 14th Field Artillery Brigades and received 3 18-pounder batteries in return. So if your eyes are watering by now, you can imagine what it must be like for the troops actually in combat at the time, moving this sort of stuff around. At the end state, though, the Field Artillery Brigade with 3 gun batteries and 1 howitzer battery was then to remain the standard building block of the Infantry Division Artillery for the remainder of the war. And indeed, it wasn't until the introduction of the gun howitzer, which was capable of firing both high and low angle immediately prior to the Second World War, that the rationale for this sort of composite organisation had to disappear. So in summary, the advantage of a howitzer capability within the divisional artillery cannot be overstated. With its high trajectory and variable charge ammunition, the howitzer was able to attack targets behind cover, and its HE shells were incredibly useful in the demolition of buildings and defence works. The howitzer ended up becoming the workhorse of the divisional artillery, with an ammunition expenditure per equipment that often far exceeded the equivalent gun rates for their 18-pounder compadres. It's probably worth speculating, actually, that the possible outcome of early operations in the Gallipoli Peninsula might have been very, very different had the 1st Australian Division had an organic howitzer brigade immediately available after the landing. So in summary, some of the key lessons that we can take from this huge transfer and huge expansion of the divisional artilleries is, first of all, that we really need to remain responsive to operations analysis lessons from the front as we go through. We also need to value our complementary firepower systems and recognise that each has its own intrinsic worth, and we need to value and regard that complementarity. Equally, we need to value the complementary ammunition systems that we have between HE or shrapnel in the case back in the First World War, but even today, the different natures that we have to be understood and used, and our advice to our manoeuvre armed commanders need to be taken into account as well. We also need to appreciate what was going on here in terms of the very carefully considered logic and the incremental approach to expansion that had to occur. Growing from effectively one divisional artillery to 5 in a matter of months has to be done very, very carefully. You can't dissipate your assets and your human assets too quickly, so you need to do that very carefully. And while we all don't want mobilisation to occur, when it happens, we need to be sure of it. Finally, I guess the agility and firepower command and control is key. And we need to ensure that our firepower C2 structures are both efficient and effective and relevant to the situation at the time. And most importantly, don't necessarily have to emulate or ape the extensions of the manoeuvre C2 that we are following and supporting. That concludes the presentation. Thank you very much.